Now we're going to talk about PNF stretching and self-myofascial release, and we're going to explain the science behind them. So remember, PNF stretching, that's where we had the joint in a specific position, and then we had a contraction of that muscle that we were stretching, and then we actually stretched it further afterwards. So it was a contract period and then a relaxation period. And PNF stretching can actually be done two different ways. The first way is called autogenic or autogenic inhibition. And for autogenic, you're going to be contracting the same muscle that you're going to be stretching. So just as an example, here I have my hamstring here. If I push down with my hamstring, I'm getting a contraction of my hamstring for 3 to 5 seconds. 1, 2, 3. I relax and then I stretch my hamstring further. That would be an example of an autogenic inhibition. And what autogenic inhibition is when you get a muscular contraction, and when that muscular contraction is significant or very high levels of contraction, you're going to activate that GTO, right? And the GTO, remember, decreases muscle activation. So when I'm contracting maximally here, contracting as hard as possible, putting a lot of tension on the tendon that connects my hamstring to my bone, that's going to cause it to relax because of autogenic inhibition. So the GTO activates, it causes that muscle to relax. And that's why after the contraction, you can actually go further than you could previously because of that GTO. The other method is reciprocal inhibition. And what reciprocal inhibition is you actually contract the opposing muscle group. So for example, if I wanted to stretch out my hamstring, remember the hamstring is going to help pull that knee into knee flexion, right? It's going to bring my heel towards my butt. That's what the hamstring does when it contracts. Well, the quadriceps is an antagonist muscle group to that, or an opposing muscle group. And so when it contracts, it's actually going to kick my knee out the other way. So if I get a contraction of my quadricep, why would that cause my hamstring to relax? Well, this goes back to the idea of muscle tension. And remember that at rest, my quads and my hamstrings aren't at 0% activation or 0% tension. They have a certain amount. So let's just say, hypothetically, my quadricep is pulling 20 pounds right now and my hamstring is pulling 20 pounds. So just like a tug of war, they're on opposite sides, they're pulling 20 pounds each, there's not going to be any movement associated. Well, if I want to move a 50-pound weight, my quadriceps now has to lift 70 pounds, right? Because it's 50 pounds of weight as well as the 20 pounds that my hamstring is contracting. So it takes 70 for me to be able to lift that weight. Well, your body knows that this is inefficient. And so what your body does when it's getting a contraction in that muscle group is it actually decreases the activation in the opposing muscle group. So if I wanted to lift a 50-pound dumbbell, instead of doing 70 pounds of force and lifting it with my quadricep, what it's going to do is it maybe uses 60 pounds of force. And then it shuts down your hamstring. So your hamstring now, instead of being at 20 pounds, it's only going to be pulling 10. And so my quadricep at 60 now can lift the 50-pound dumbbell or the 50-pound weight because the hamstring isn't pulling as hard. That's reciprocal inhibition. So reciprocal inhibition, when we contract the muscle group, it starts to decrease the activation in the opposing or antagonist muscle group. And this is going to be a really important concept. So for PNF, we get that contraction in our quad, that causes the hamstring to relax. Now we can stretch the hamstring further because we've decreased the tone of that muscle. Now, remember the key points for PNF stretching was we never do it before activity. We always make sure the muscle is warmed up, and we need about 20 to 30 minutes of activity before we would start doing this. And it could be cardiovascular activity, it could be weight training activity, but we don't just jump straight into this PNF stretching. We also said you need to have twice as long of a stretching period as the contraction period. So if we contracted for 3 to 5 seconds, which is the general recommendation, we would then need to stretch 6 to 10 seconds minimum. And there are even some protocols where you actually stretch 3 or 4 times as long as the contraction period. But that's the basic idea of PNF. So it can work one of two ways. Either that autogenic, same muscle is contracting, same muscle, so I'm pushing down, then we're stretching the hamstring and we're getting that good stretch. Or it could be reciprocal inhibition, where now I'm contracting my quad as hard as possible, contract that quad, now the quad's relaxed, and now I can stretch even further. Those are the two ways PNF works. Now we're going to talk about self-myofascial release. And if you remember in class, we said that self-myofascial release is a type of massage. And what it's doing is it's targeting your fascia. And if you remember back when we were talking about our proprioceptors, we said we had Ruffini endings, and what they do is they respond to pressure, or they respond to massage. And you have a lot of these Ruffini endings in your fascia. Now, what exactly is fascia? It is a connective tissue that surrounds your muscles and holds them together and puts them into different groups and connects them, right? So it's, instead of having muscles all over the place, contracting, moving around, it encases them, it surrounds them to help them. Okay, so this is my muscle. The fascia is going to be on the outside and it's going to be wrapping around it. Now, fascia is really cool because it is a connective tissue that also has muscle built in. And so fascia can actually increase tension and it can actually contract. So right now it's kind of in a relaxed state. This can move freely, it can spin, it can rotate because the fascia isn't as tight. However, if we contracted that fascia and we actually torqued it, so I'll show you right here, we get a lot of tension there, that would restrict the tissue inside and we wouldn't get as much rotation internally. And that's what's essentially happening with your fascia when you have this overactivation of it, is it will actually be around a muscle and it'll actually start contracting and it'll actually tighten around that muscle and you won't get as much movement or range of motion. And so what this massage technique does is it puts pressure on the fascia so that the fascia actually releases and allows for more motion internally. So that's the idea of self-myofascial release. Now, how do we do self-myofascial release in an effective manner? A common mistake you'll see with people is they'll take a foam roller or they'll take their implement and they'll just roll the entire muscle really quickly back and forth. And they'll actually create a lot of friction and a lot of heat when they're doing this. This actually doesn't really help with this self-myofascial release. It doesn't cause an activation or a signal from those Ruffini endings, right? Ruffini endings need pressure, but they need that pressure to be steady and or constant for an extended period of time. So just rolling back and forth really aggressively doesn't help you do that. Instead, we want to use a technique called search and destroy. And what search and destroy is you're going down the length of that muscle until you find a knot, or more specifically, what we call a trigger point. And a trigger point is just an area of high levels of tension, which if you put pressure on them can actually cause the surrounding tissue to relax. So as I'm going through my foam rolling, maybe right here, I find one of those trigger points. It feels kind of knotted up. What I'm gonna do, instead of just rocking back and forth on it and just getting a lot of that friction, is I'm gonna keep my foam roller there and I'm gonna do subtle or small movements, either forwards or backwards or left and rights, but I'm keeping that pressure on that trigger point for about 15 to 20 seconds. So it's pressure, keeping it on the trigger point, 15 to 20 seconds, left and right, and that's gonna help ease it up better than just rolling the entire muscle. So rolling the entire muscle, we're gonna go through the entire muscle to see where our trigger points are, but that's not what we're doing, just going back and forth. We're looking for a trigger point, and when we find it, we then add pressure on top of it. Now, we said that we don't want this to be overly painful. And the reason we don't want it to be overly painful is because when you experience pain, you actually your body goes into a guarding mode or a protective mechanism. So you experience pain, it will increase tension. If you've ever stepped on a Lego before, you've experienced pain, like you clench your jaw, you get really tense, you really get really tight. Well, if the idea of self-myofascial release is to decrease muscle tension, too much pain is actually going to inhibit that process and inhibit your ability to get that reduction. And so pain is associated with this guarding, and we know that guarding decreases your range of motion. So on a pain scale, you would want to be at a 5 to 6 in terms of pain or discomfort. And an easy way of knowing if you're at a 5 or a 6 is whether or not it affects your breathing. And so typically pain above a 6, you'll start seeing your breathing becomes more shallow, you'll start breathing more through your chest instead of through your belly, or you'll hold your breath to maintain it as long as possible. All right, all these three things are going to tell us that maybe you're experiencing too much pain and you would want to reduce the amount of pressure being put on that trigger point. So a 5 or a 6. As well as that, we want to make sure we're breathing normally, because that's what's going to help us increase that range of motion. And when I say breathing normally, I don't just mean breathing in and out. I want you to focus on diaphragmatic breathing or belly breathing. So I want your belly to go out and in as you're breathing. So we go out, and that will facilitate a better range of motion increase.